Boom. Okay, we are recording. Hi, everybody. This is David P. France, and I'm coming to you from Basel, Switzerland. And before we get started, I want to make sure that you share the videos, like the videos, and subscribe to either social media channel, David P. France TV on YouTube or BitChute. And of course, all of you guys who have been following me for this long, I want to thank you because we're making an impact, right? We're talking about creators and creators, writers, artists, musicians, thought leaders, small business people, entrepreneurs. So today we are speaking to Alexandra D'Italia. Yeah, like we call her Alex, right? And Alex and I know each other a long time, right? Like we go back to my middle school days. Well, you were in a different middle school, but by the time we met, we were, I think, in 9th grade at the time, right? So it's this South Orange Maplewood school system in New Jersey, northern New Jersey, and colleague. I haven't seen her in person for a long time. How are you?
I'm good. I'm hanging in there. Heat wave, California's burning, but we're hanging in.
And tell everybody what you do and where you were located, and that was just a little short tagline before we jump in.
I'm living in Los Angeles, and when I say Los Angeles, I mean the city of Los Angeles, not the county of Los Angeles. I'm right smack in the city, and in a lovely neighborhood called Atwater Village. And I am a writer, a podcaster, a art community leader, and a law school writing professor. I think that gets to everything I do. And traveler. I always like to put that in there because I think it's important as a value statement. So those are all the things that I'm doing, although not traveling right now with the pandemic. But
we're all kind of in lockdown, right?
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Before we go further, why is travel for you a part of your value?
You know, it's funny, I'm working on a collection of personal essays, and so I've really been trying to get to have this sort of snippet of a really good elevator pitch answer to this question. But I really think that I travel a lot, and I call it travel rather than sightseeing, because I travel in order to, one, gain perspective, right? So for me, especially living in LA, where it is a very materialist culture, a very capitalistic culture, I really find that it's super important for me at least once a year to like remind myself of the rest of the world. And so just sort of walk through the world in a different space and immerse myself, because that gives me perspective from starting to feel sorry for myself. Oh, my day is hard, or oh, this is going on. And then I come home like, oh my God, I'm so grateful for everything I've been, blessed with.
Yeah.
And the second reason is I just love observing other culture, the way other people walk through the world, the way art and expression sort of play out in all sorts of different areas, and to really experience that. And so, I started, do you know what woofing is?
I've heard the term, but explain it to me.
So it's worldwide organic opportunities for farms. And for the last 10 years, I've been volunteering for a time, on a farm, doing manual labor, 6-8 hours a day in exchange for room and board. And so I've managed to do that in Alaska, Hungary, England,
oh my God,
Wales, northern Thailand, where I got to stay with a family in the Karen tribe in northern Thailand, and worked on a 100-year-old rice field. And it just kind of blows your mind sort of what those experiences do for you about how much shared humanity we have. That's sort of, and, but I gotta say, the other thing is I really like to test my grit. I really like to sort of see, oh, sure, that's a flea-ridden mat. I'm gonna sleep on that. Or, wow, I'm at somebody's house and they're serving rat. I'm gonna eat it and enjoy it. So.
Of course, I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing with you because, I put myself in similar situations in more ways than one. We won't go into, right? Because we're interviewing you. Oh my God. So look, tell us about the podcast, because you touched on this. We talked before we actually have the interview, and you mentioned that you have this particular podcast. Can you elaborate on that?
So my friend Lenya, who is a Black woman, and she's my age, she's from the Bronx, but we both live out here in LA, but we have that sort of what we were talking about before. We have this sort of East Coast, New York, New Jersey kind of grit and attitude about us. And so we connected immediately when we met. And after the George Floyd murder and video and the Karen incident in Central Park, we were sort of talking, and we're both on lockdown, and we're like, oh, we should, I don't know how it came up, but I was like, I really think there should be a podcast about what Black women need to say to white women. And she's like, let's do it. And we're like on a Zoom call, and she had already ordered the mic. And I'm like, well, I guess we're doing a podcast. And so, we're both sort of polymaths in the instant that, she's a celebrity stylist, a sommelier, and a champion powerlifter. So she's a rock star. And we just have this weekly podcast talking about race and womanhood at the hearth level. And some things, it's interesting because we're talking about what it's like what the term Karen really means, and how do we forgive and move on, or what is a microaggression and what that really means, and how do we move forward in the world, because in this polarized, slightly angry world, everybody's sort of just saying this is this and this and this. And I was like, okay, but how do we just sit and hang out and and move on, like heal and move on. So, we're 8 episodes recorded. I think 6 episodes are out, and we're doing really well. We have a nice little following building it, and we're going to look to expand the conversation and bring in people of different generations, because David, you and I have both talked about Gen X and how, and I really identify very strongly as Gen X. And so that idea is like bringing in Gen Y, bringing in millennials into the conversation to sort of hear different viewpoints and really still move towards healing. Yeah. Because there has to be an after. There has to be an after.
Do you find that and in my last conversation I was having with someone, it's someone who's a martial arts or artist, actor, studio owner, model, and there are a lot of cross things that we do as like someone who dances and someone who is a martial artist, right? So it's more the same. What I'm finding is that people are not trained to come to this juncture, right? People are sort of trained to be in opposition a lot. And I think that when you're talking about trying to create, right, coming to some understanding very quickly is very important for really, really great creation. And usually, okay, if you're an individual, it's easy for an individual to do it like when you're alone and there's nobody else around. But the moment that you're trying to sort of build a creation, like, some of the ones we've talked about when you go to Europe and you see these grand things, it requires a team of people and some sort of understanding. And I think the challenge for the United States, the Americans, is that how do we move all of this stuff out of the way so that we can continue to be, or try to be, or this great nation of people, right? And I think that at this moment is where we're having issues.
Yes.
I mean, what is your feeling from the couple of podcasts that you guys have had so far?
Well, I mean, I think that I completely agree in the sense that this is where I can agree with, if you haven't figured it out, I'm very much a lefty. So, I mean, The idea is that the Republicans are right that the social fabric is stretched thin or worn out, or the weaving there's snags in the weaving, if we think about it, and that's a place of commonality where I think everybody could agree with that.
When you say the snagging in the weaving, what is that? Elaborate a little.
When I think about a community, I really think about I think about a beautiful woven fabric, and that it's a community that's working together. And so you can have each individual thread, but to actually, hold something, survive, keep somebody warm, the weaving needs to work, right? And the idea is we're not as strong as we used to be, and while there are people in this country who believe, okay, then let's make everybody go to church, or everybody should have this particular kind of thing. I think there are other ways to create community, and to create connection. And, we grew up in the 70s, right? Where there was the sense of immigrants assimilated, and now we're in, I think, a more honest, authentic world of multiculturalism. But there's a shadow to multiculturalism, right? Is in the sense of everybody's so like me, this is who I am, and that we're really forgetting, or this is who my small group is. And I was like, okay, but now we put two groups here. What connects the two groups? And we're not really weaving all of it together anymore. And, how do we do that? I think we do it through art, expression, literature, emotional, intuitive connection, because we're all human. And so figuring out what those commonalities are, and then figuring out ways to build community. And for me, compassion and forgiveness have to, and quite frankly, a reckoning. Okay, so a reckoning, compassion, and forgiveness are sort of the things that need to happen to move on.
Well, it's interesting also that I think it's the Gen X. Now, this is just coming from me, and this is my opinion. I think it's Gen X because we were how we grew up. I think the burden of this, all of the things that you described, plus the tightening of the weaving, or is really falling on us. Not everybody is taking that mantle, right? Not everyone is seeing it, but I clearly see it. I see it at work. I see it in interacting with people in town, whatever. I see it even in this pandemic, how people are interacting. I see the people that are currently represented in our government, or who's not represented in our government. And quite frankly, before we jump into I think talking about Maplewood, South Orange, part of the reason why I knew that I could create this interview series, right, or podcast, however you want to call it, is because of our common experience as people that were at the forefront of this attempt to interweave the variety of people in a tapestry, as you've so described. So we are really the ones that can see it.
I completely agree. What makes part of that, right, is not even the characteristics of Gen X. It's really just that Gen X, we're in our 40s and 50s. I mean, let's just call it what it is. We're in our 40s, we're in between. And so we're in that perfect spot where, millennials are really busy at this point just trying to stay alive, right? That's what you're doing in your 30s. It's you're trying to stay alive. You're trying to figure out, what is my career? If you're a woman, you might be saying, wow, it might be really hard to have a child. They're trying to have children, whatever it is. People in their 20s, that's when I was angry and more polarized and sort of the zealots. And then people older than us, the baby boomers, are settling down and sort of getting, not to say rigid, but they're sort of saying, oh, they're set in their ways. This is getting changed. So it's us. But then on top of us, we're Gen X. So we've been latchkey kids. Our mother, we were, at least as women, the first generation that could really sort of say you could have everything, except that all the material coming at us was, you can have it all, but yes, definitely get married. Yes, definitely have babies. Yes, definitely do it this way. You know, definitely
Yes.
have a car garage, you know, and we were still being fed. I think all of us still being fed, that is the way to go forward. And most of us, a lot of us, and what I love about where we grew up is that a lot of us rejected that.
Yeah.
And I have such great pride about the place where I grew up. Although when I was 17, I couldn't wait to get out.
Right.
But I have such great pride of place because so many of us rejected some version of that dream and started creating our own thing.
All right, so back up. So I'm trying to think, what was it about where we grew up, which is South Orange, Maplewood, New Jersey, northern New Jersey, just so you guys know. What was it about that particular area, and what did we reject? I mean, I just to be clear, can you give us examples of what people rejected?
Sure. When I think about some of the people from the top of our class who went to excellent schools, who could have just moved into making money, becoming lawyers, which we both did, becoming lawyers, becoming doctors, or doing whatever, they went and became teachers. And really, you know, teachers are not well paid in this country. And so really setting themselves apart from the keeping up with the Joneses mentality and sort of stepping off that wheel and saying, no, it's really important to be a teacher. And I have to think that since we have so many educators in our class, at least, that that's a little bit of a testament to being raised and having good teachers. And we were like, oh, we want to be a part of it. I think that I'm child-free, and I'm not the only child-free person from Columbia High School. No. And I know there are lots of child-free people out there, but the fact is that I have more child-free friends from high school than college.
Okay.
You know, so just so when you sort of start mapping it out, and I feel like that's a choice for a woman, especially in my generation, where that was a hard thing to stand through.
But you got over the hump, right? I mean, there's a hump that you kind of, isn't it?
Well, when you hit 40, when you hit 40, people give up on you, David. Like, people stop saying it. Like, that is
I get it. You know, I get it, right?
Yeah, no.
I was like this, because I experienced that hump. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I mean, nobody asks now. It's kind of nice, but I have to say, like, when I was 30, it was constant. Like, you know, you'll change your mind. I was like, since I was 6, I never wanted kids. Can we just leave it alone? You know, even with getting married, because we didn't, you know, even that, like, you know, I have a partner, but I was never really a big fan of the institution of marriage, and I just didn't want to get married. And I just remember my partner, Eric, having a conversation with his dad saying, you know, we're not going to get married. Like, come back from Fantasy Island. It's not happening.
At 6, you were thinking this? Like you said, I don't want to have children, and I don't want to get married. I mean, was this?
Yeah, like this is really probably a testament to my parents, but probably especially my mom. And don't laugh at me, but I hated dolls as a kid, but I would play, my favorite game as a kid was Witches Club.
What is Witches Club? Witches Club?
Oh,
what is that?
Well, basically it was me making mud concoctions and saying spells and then making my sister drink the mud. I mean,
I'm with it. I'm with it.
Like me torturing my sister.
Right.
And I was president of that club, by the way.
You were president of the Witches?
Yes, I was. And I would play like boss. Like we would play office where I was the boss.
Did you call the game Let's Play Boss? Did you say Let's Play Boss or just
Office? Let's play Office. I would say Let's play Office. And we would go into like the inside of a rhododendron, like it was inside a big rhododendron that kind of had like, you know, little tree. It felt like a tree house. And we would play, and I would boss all
everybody
the kids
around.
around.
Right, I get it. I understand.
I just feel like I was born without a domestic bone. Like I just don't have it. And it's so when people say, oh, was it a political reason? Was it this? Like I was like, I don't know. I mean, my mother definitely you know, we stumped for the ERA. Like I was in the 70s, and like, you know, I had the Equal Rights Amendment pin, and like we went and I worked with my mom on the campaign. I mean,
you were doing it.
I was doing it, and so you can call it brainwash, you can call it whatever, but it just feels very organic to me. It wasn't a head decision; it was a heart decision that I didn't want either of those things growing up. And really, it took leaving the East Coast and coming to San Francisco to sort of feel like, you know, oh, I'm among my people. Like I'm not, people aren't fighting me on it so much.
Right. Because out there, it's like, you know, and I've not spent significant time in LA, but I do, you know, when I'm there or when I was there, you know, I could notice a tremendous difference in terms of, and that's when I started to link, you know, people's energy to the actual environment, right? So I would be feeling people's energy first, and I think people would attribute that to the environment. But I was like, it's the people out here that's creating this environment in connection with what, you know, the weather and everything else around, right?
There is a belief, I think in San Francisco and in LA, where people sort of, I mean, I still think money is really important to people in this end of the country. I'm not saying that, but there's a very large tolerance for, oh, I want to do more than one thing. Like I want to be, you know, I want to sell green juice, and I want to have a podcast, and I'm going to be a doctor. Like, and I can do all three things. And, or I have a former student who is a children's rights lawyer. And so she spends all day like working for the benefit of children. And yet she's an actor, a director, and a producer. And I just saw on Facebook that she's got a film out that's going to be in the Black American Film Festival. And so, you know, like she's doing two things. And she's where most people would say, you're a lawyer, just be a lawyer. And she's like, no, like I also want to pursue art and I want to express myself. And she's doing it. I just find that there's a real openness to that here, where not that it isn't open in other places, but it just feels like you don't feel like a misfit for sort of saying, oh, I want to do something slightly different. Yeah. At least this is, I mean, when I moved to California in 1991, that was how I felt. I mean, I've been here a long time.
You've been here for a long time. Well, you know, we've had another interview with a fellow South Orange Maplewood alum, if you want to call it. He didn't necessarily go all the way through Columbia and the other schools, but you remember Patrick Barnett. Do you remember Patrick Barnett? Yeah, I interviewed him and I actually had an email conversation with him, and I only interacted with him very, very small. You know, it was like he was in middle school and then he was gone. He went to Seton Hall. But he's, you know, he's doing it all like you are. Like he's acting, and I think he's singing, and he's, you know, doing, I wouldn't necessarily say stunt work, but when they asked him to, can you do this stunt work or can you do that? So, I mean, like, it's just an interesting thing. And I think, again, just to go back to the platform, and then I'm going to continue and ask you about college and career and stuff. But I think this podcast is coming out of this sort of shared belief that you can do more than one thing, you know, and I'm doing it here in Switzerland now. The people here in Switzerland are kind of looking at me with the side eye, but there is a value to what I'm doing and bringing to the workplace for sure. You know,
absolutely. And I think tying that back to Gen X, I mean, we're really the first generation that sort of felt that maybe we wouldn't outpace our parents. And so in that sense, we might move laterally, you know, and I think it's made for a more interesting life, and for many of us at least. But I do think a lot of that is just pressure on the generation that, oh, like I am not going, like I could work. There was a confidence in my parents, at least for my parents, not to speak anywhere else, I guess, not to generalize, but a confidence that even as, you know, my dad was first generation American, even like moving through that, he had confidence that he would succeed. I didn't quite have that same level of confidence, whether it's personal or not. Like I knew I would succeed in the sense that I'd have a roof over my head, that I would be able to work hard, that I had so much privilege coming into the world, coming into adulthood. Like, of course that was there. But the idea that, you know, my parents brought me up saying, yes, like we did, you know, your grandparents sacrificed, then we did this, and now you're going to go further. And I think the world was like, nah, maybe that's not going to happen. And the fact is you recreate your life. And I think it's recreated our life to sort of be like, well, I want to live outside that box anyway. And it's really, I mean, for me, it's been great.
Yeah, but I think some people might be looking at us, people that will watch this video, and say that we have actually done, you know, bigger or better than our parents. I mean, maybe initially when you told them the plan, they're looking at you again with the side eye, like, you know what I mean? And now as it's starting to, and I can say that for myself, that, yeah, there are a couple of a lot of risky things that I did, right? That were, people were like, what? You know, it didn't make sense. It's not, to me, I think it's making more sense now than ever, right? But I think, you know, part of it is that I knew that these stories had to be told, because if they weren't told, and if you look at what's going on in the media, right? You don't see, in my opinion, this is my humble opinion, you do not see the Maplewood South Orange crew, you know, throughout the media explaining what's happening, you know, at this particular moment in time. I mean, we're not there, you know, as mouthpieces to sort of what is possible, right? It's almost like a little club. It's a little club. So I knew that it had to be exposed. And also, let's say I feel the same way with regard to my university experience. I'm going to jump into yours quickly. That a lot of people were kind of in the same boat as we were in South Orange and Maplewood, but they actually did the reverse of what you and I did. So they actually went for the bigger house, the bigger this, the more money. Like they made a decision, and we went right and they went left.
Yeah, it's true.
Right. So I can point to a lot of people. And now this is why the conversation is more important, because we're in the middle of this pandemic or whatever. And I'm like, wait a minute, we're the ones that create. We're the ones that, you know, are, you know, behind intellectual property, copyright, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to step out and explain to people what it is, or, you know, our value, you know, to what we're bringing.
I think that's important. You're doing important work.
Yeah. Well, tell us, what was your experience like in college and career? I mean, you talked about this before, and then your law school experience.
Yeah. So I went to Franklin and Marshall College, and it was not a good experience. So we can't, like, it like, so I wish I could sort of say, oh, and it was amazing. I feel bad about that, because there were lovely people, but here's the deal. My family life sort of disintegrated, and even though I was not ready to go to college, so quite frankly, I should have taken a gap year. Like, this is where, like, somebody should have said, you know what? Why don't you take a couple of years, mature, figure out like what works, what doesn't. But that said, great education, and it also really exposed me to what I didn't want. Like, it was a really great experience in several things. Like, so one, it's the only 4 years of my life where I really gave into fear. So it was a great lesson in don't do that anymore.
You know, like how so? Give it into fear. Like, what do you mean?
Well, I kind of knew by the end of my first year that it wasn't a fit for me, like as a school. But I sort of said, well, the devil you know. And I just seriously white knuckled my way through a place where I didn't really feel like I fit in, rather than take a risk and transfer to maybe a more urban school or a larger school or to take time off. But I made no brave decision. I just sort of said, follow the norm. And that was a great lesson that I can do that, but it didn't feed me. And I was very politically active back then.
Yes.
And while that fed me, academics didn't feed me. And the only other thing that fed me was writing. And I wrote a lot, didn't show anyone because it was just I was too ashamed. I really did sort of feel like, you know, I need to be a lawyer, a doctor, an archaeologist.
That pressure kind of.
Yeah, you know, and whether that was family or upbringing or just in my head, I really did sort of believe that pressure was real. But I also noticed that lots of students were talking about getting married, we're talking about management training programs, we're talking about getting the first apartment and then saving for the condo and then saving for the house. And I felt like this great weight on my chest. And I was like, this is not me. I went to DC after college and worked for a trade association. And I really did have this amazing mentor who's like, you're a pretty good writer. And I got sort of a chance to sort of write and again, sort of explore the negative. Like, I don't want this. I don't want this. I don't want this life. Seeing the blue blazer life. Like, I don't want this. And then here's the thing. They sent me to San Francisco for a conference. And David, I landed in that city and I'm like, it was as if birds were singing. It was like, you must go here. You must come to San Francisco. I mean, I remember like standing, so cliche, but standing on the top of Nob Hill and being able to see blue from two places and no car. And so I just was like this, and the creative energy in that city in the 90s, it was so alive. And I went home, I was applying to law school, and I said, you know what, I'm gonna apply to schools in San Francisco. And Golden Gate gave me a full ride, and I'm like, see ya. And and then even by my second year in law school, I loved law school, but I was like, I don't even want to be a lawyer. Like, I was taking fiction and photography classes because it was like, it like unleashed the world to me. And it was an exciting time of my life.
I get it. I mean, I get it because, I mean, you had a specific perspective growing up in northern New Jersey. And by just going out there and seeing sort of like what was built, what was being built and continued, you know, was continuing, you felt like, I can do this. And with the last interview, we talked about flow and energy and how important that is. And it's one of the reasons why, let's say, for example, when I went to law school in New Orleans, I got into the business school before I got into the law school. So I had to literally, I literally had to psych my way into law school. That's a whole other discourse. That's a whole other discussion. But I got in by the skin of my, but I was like, oh, I'm going to be living here. Like that, I was so set on living there because of, you know, what it represented.
Absolutely. I love that city. I mean, that's, when you go, I am a person, I do find it's different. Don't you find that there are people who are situational oriented in the sense that they'll go where the job is? I've noticed I'm very place oriented. Like, I didn't want to go where the job was. I didn't care. I was like, I'll figure out how to live in San Francisco because that's where I want to be. And it didn't really matter. And I think that's sort of really important, like to sort of understand who you are. Because when I travel, I also feel that way. Like I could travel somewhere and I feel like, oh, this is a really great place to visit.
Mhm.
But sort of like when I was in Bristol, in England, I was like, I could live here. Like this feels good, this city.
And,
like
and Bristol has a vibe to it, right? From what I understand.
It has a great vibe. And you just want to be the same way when I'm in New York. I'm like, oh my God, I could totally live I totally love this. But if I could go, I love Chicago. I love Chicago, but it doesn't have a vibe that meets me, So I love it. I love to visit. I'm probably not going to live there. When I went to Malawi, and this is the thing, like, when I went to Malawi the first time and I was at Jacaranda, the school, it was the same thing. It was like, how does this feel like home, even though it's not home?
Okay.
And it's this amazing essence, and San Francisco had that for me. And it's, and it just sort of allowed me to explore myself and still stay active, like using my JD. I mean, after grad school, I was, or after law school, I was a criminal defense attorney. So, I mean, I felt like very righteous work. And I had a chance to work with Stuart Hanlon on the Geronimo Pratt case. So like my first case after law school was being a little baby attorney driving up to Mule Creek State Prison and visiting a Black Panther who was wrongfully convicted of a crime 20 years before. Right. And like, that was my first case.
Yeah, that's huge. It's huge.
And when we talk about stories, I would sit in the attorney client room with him on the little tiny chairs, with the table up to your knees so you can't exchange anything underneath the table. Right. With a little plastic bag of change because inmates weren't allowed to handle money. So like I would have to carry in change to buy him stuff at the vending machine. Okay. And he would tell me stories.
And he has a lot.
Yeah. And I've got to say, like that is where I was like, my life is going to be a little bit different because I was less interested in the minutia of the law and more interested in the narrative. And so like, it really was Geronimo that began my like saying, all right, I got to move away. I'm moving away from practice as fast as I can. And I'm going to figure out some other way to do this.
It's very interesting that you said that. I'm gonna relate quickly a story that's very similar, which is even though this experience, I mean, it wasn't like quite like yours. In law school, they had these little externships where you would work with actual attorneys, and we went to the prison Angola out in Louisiana, right? And the funny thing was that I just literally watched, right? Because there was already an attorney there and she was hogging everything, right? So it wasn't like they were gonna give me anything. Sometimes when you work, you're there collecting a check or just taking up space, but they're not gonna let you do anything. So, but it was great to experience what that was like. And I think that's when I was interested in using it as a journalistic, platform. Right, like so I would know what lawyers know, and that could actually help me with regard to presenting stories in a certain way that I would not have been able to do straight out of college or even without going to college, right? So there's that lens, that multi-faceted lens, which is important. And let's say, for example, because you're doing all this stuff, this is just my point of view, and I don't know if other people share it. When you represent somebody, when you decide to represent, because you still do it occasionally, right?
I haven't in 15
so many
years.
different angles to present the information. Where the average attorney, and you don't know what is going to resonate when you submit that brief and that lawyer, that judge reads that brief, even though he's supposed to be or she's supposed to be looking for law.
Right.
They are still influenced by all kinds of other things that are happening, right?
Oh, absolutely. There's a great quote, and I use it in one of my classes. I head up, I'm co-director of a Moot court program at Southwestern Law School. And one of the quotes, I think it's Justice Hughes, who will say, like, at the constitutional level, like where he's a justice, decisions are based on emotion. Yeah. And then the reasons are found to support those elections. And I was like, yes, like how can you how can you have some of our decisions otherwise, where, Bowers v. Hardwick, where basically the Supreme Court, this was in the 80s, held that, oh, sure, states can completely criminalize sodomy and can completely criminalize like homosexual sexual activity, like based on sexual orientation. Lawrence v. Texas, 10, 20 years later, say, oh no, states can't do that. There is, I'm sorry, you can give me all the laws and reasoning you want, and you can have any common law professor say, well, it's blah, 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 and this is how it fixes. I was like, oh, come on. Society grew up. Like, that's what happened.
It's a change.
Like the emotions, the culture changed, the culture became more expansive, and we woke up. And that's the decision. And it's emotional. Like you can't, of course it is.
And the funny thing is, one of the reasons why I had issues with law school is because I was there trying to change things before knowing what the law was. So I was only interested in policy. But on the legal exam, you only get a point for that.
No, it's so true. Like I had the same problem. Like I'm always interested in the forest view, like in the policy view, like how it's going to play out. I'm interested a lot in law and society. And it's funny, like I am always hard on my students when they take I used to teach women in the law, and I would say to students, I don't want a college women's studies paper. But that's because I was like, I don't want a social paper. But I was like, but I get it, because I also really want to write a social paper. Like,
because you got to train them. You got to train them the way that the way they work, right? The way that the system works. So I get it, even though I didn't do it. And look, I'll give you this one little quick story, and there's so much I want to ask you. I convinced the criminal law professor to use OJ as a fact pattern because OJ was like the big case.
Yeah.
Now every day we're like, look, you don't understand. This is the thing. You've got to bring this in. And the whole exam was on OJ. And I was like, even though I don't think I did well on it, but I was like, it's OJ. Like I thought, Dave, you influence.
Yeah.
Every day I would talk about it.
I always joke because there is, I am sure at Golden Gate, there was a file of all the petitions that I sent the school on all the ways that the school needed to be better. I was so surprised, and my mentor really played a great part in this, is allowing me to teach there, because I was there, because I'm sure they were like, we want this kid to teach after she was in our office complaining about everything and telling us all the ways that stuff was wrong. And like now, when I have those students who are complaining, I'm like, oh God, this is my curse. This is me. Yeah. Like it was me. Like just save your energy. They're laughing at you. Like
yeah, look, I mean, but I would say that, your career was being shaped even when you were in the midst of like doing this and going against the grain and learning this, the way things work in the system, et cetera.
Absolutely, right? I mean, I always tell students the thing that's great about a JD, and it took me a long time to kind of come to terms with this because I had student loans I had to pay and I didn't want to practice. And so it would definitely, because when somebody says they have a scholarship to law school, that doesn't mean your living expenses are paid for. So I still took out loans, and I was a moronic 23-year-old. So I was like, sushi on student loans. And so, but the thing is that, JD gives you a seat at the table.
I think
it's
so.
It's a very empowering degree because it gives you a tool set of how to think in a particular way. And then, as I started really developing my creative writing, I mean, I joke it's a different tool set, and I think it's an advantage to have both, although I laugh that like a first draft of anything I write will have way too many howevers in it. Okay. Because it's just, I gotta like rip out the analytical side of myself and actually just get real. And then be able to also switch hats for the more formal world of law school, which I'm a bit of a misfit there, but Southwestern is great and accepts me for who I am, which I am very appreciative of.
What you talked about your writing, or we before having this interview, we were supposed to get to that, but what kinds of short stories are you writing, or is it short stories, or what? Give us an idea of what's going on in that space.
I mean, I'm switching now to personal essay for a lot of reasons, but I really started out writing short fiction, and a lot of my short fiction was examining the domestic situations. So in a sense of examining relationships, that all the things that are unsaid or the spaces that are unsaid. And my parents and my family will roll their eyes because I would usually take one of them and begin to fictionalize from there. And so the constant tension of when a new story would get published, they're like, oh no, like what has she stolen from our lives now? But I mean, the first story I had that got published, which was, way back in my mid-20s, it was about a marriage where the woman was so interested in watching the X-Files, like so obsessed with the X-Files that she began to think it was true. And she had like all sorts of like little figurine collections in her house. And she and her husband were not getting along. They were spending clearly too much time together, pandemic. But it wasn't a pandemic. This was, 1995 or whatever. And he was in the bathroom, probably watching porn, but she becomes convinced that he's an alien. And then that's sort of the start of the story. And then it just gets weirder and more absurd from there. But really started examining the relationship. And then I remember when it came out, and I was really almost modeling it after my partner Eric's parents. And what's funny though is that my mother calls me. She's like, "Is this about me?" And I'm like,
So when it comes out, where does the literature come out, or like what publications would be?
It's always, the thing is that's hard about literary journals is that they come out and then they go away, and then it isn't like somebody can Google me and then find all these. But I've been published in the South Loop Review, which is a review in Chicago. I've been published in Arcadia. I've been published in, just recently last year, I had a short story come out in Underwood Press. So just all small literary
journals. These are places where people get their work. Now, when your mother said, "Is this about me?" Did you send, like, how does she get a hold of it? Do you send a copy, or does she actually figure out a way to get it herself?
In the early days, I used to send a copy. And I stopped doing that with her because it really would upset her, and so I didn't do it anymore. And I was like, you can find it if you want to, but I have to say, I had a short play staged in New York at the Producers Theater on Broadway 9th, and I got to say, after. My family was so supportive, and I have a very big Italian-American family. The producer took me aside. He's like, anytime you want to play produced, like, you just let me know, because your
instant
family
audience.
is here.
Audience. You need the audience.
Exactly.
Right?
But that play was totally playing on my sister's life as a mom of two, early mom of two. And like how isolated mothers feel. And I used, the fact is that my entire family are so eloquent and so, what is the word? Punchy. Like their language carries a lot of weight, that I often feel like when I'm writing dialogue, I'm just reporting. Like I'm not, or channeling. It doesn't necessarily, even if I change the characters and change things up, like I don't really feel like I need to work hard for that dialogue, because I've grown up in a place where the snappy comeback or the hyperbole or the subtext is always straight. So it's always been really easy for me.
It's very, very interesting, because one of my favorite how do you say, she's not really a thought leader, she's a professor, is Camille Paglia at the University of the Arts, right? So one of the things that I like is that she somehow, I mean, she's well-read and she knows all this stuff, but what I like, and this is very close to the way a choreographer works, is she takes words that by themselves, and that maybe all authors and writers are supposed to do this, but by themselves are colloquial. And she sort of puts it in a way so that she, again, brings energy and levity to words that would be dismissed by a particular audience, or phrases or phraseology, if that's a word, by a particular group. And it, as a result, it becomes, or it makes for a very hard-hitting expression, right? And she can do it in a very short period of, sentences. So likewise with movement, it's the same way, that you're trying to use movement that sort of, there's a juxtaposition, or there's sort of a grading, as you use the word, but in a good way,
right?
So that the energy is much bigger than each of the words itself, if that makes any sense.
Oh, no, it absolutely does. I mean, that's what I really love about, I mean, I can nerd out on writing for a long time and really like think about like how important language is. I mean, I used to always think that if I went for a PhD, I would do it in history or I would do it in American studies. And now I'm like, oh, but maybe a PhD in linguistics would be interesting, because really the evolution of language and how we stretch it and what's formal versus what is colloquial, but what lands on people, right? Because really what we're talking about when we bring it back to what's going on in the country right now is that we're having a real shift in how we value language, that it's not the language of the speaker, it's the language as it's received, right? So when we think about the microaggressions, we're saying, but I didn't, you have a person saying, but I didn't mean that, I didn't intend that. Well, that doesn't matter. It was received in this way, in this context, and it's making precision matter a little more, right? Sure. And really, and really asking people to pause before they speak, which is difficult. I'm not good at that. I talk a lot. I don't think first, but I'm always happy to apologize after. But I mean, I think that's really exciting about language. And as somebody who has concentrated on short form, I love sort of the idea of how you play with language and how you sort of evoke emotion from the reader.
Well, I'll tell you another quick South Orange story. We're in this class, English class, senior year. They're making us read all of these books. I think it's second semester. I'm not going to call out this person, Kathy Professor, but she was the favorite person in the class. And I don't remember, I can't even remember. I don't even remember but the teacher had their favorites. And I'm listening to, I'm like, they're making us read. What was it? It was, good God, what was that book called? She made, what is it? I think it was Death of a Salesman. Now, okay. In the pantheon of literature, I know it's very important. Just like when you go to law school, you're supposed to read certain cases, right? I understand that. But I'm telling you, it might have been The Professor. At that particular time, I was looking at life through this racial lens.
Sure.
So I was like, why am I even in this class listening to this lady talk to me about Death of a Salesman? What is this? How is this important, right? Now, I will say many, many years later, I can tell you why it's important, and the fact that I know it, right, will tell people that I am in a certain bracket, I guess, of educated, people. But I didn't take it as seriously as I should have or could have, based on where I was at the moment, right? So I will say there's some writers, though, that I immediately was like, okay, so why isn't, just like the OJ stuff, why isn't this being taught? Why is it so? The Thomas Wolfe book, Bonfire of the Vanities, I was like, this one should go right to the head of the class.
I agree.
This one should be required reading. Now, I don't know if I'd have to read it again to see whether it really
stands up.
It stands up. But when I read that book, I was like, amen. And another book was, I think she made us read Tom Sawyer or something like that. And I'm like,
yeah.
But Tom Sawyer's Pudd'nhead Wilson Now that one, I was like, this one speaks because of the in my opinion, of how race, how important it was.
Sure.
Right. So it's a story of like two babies that were switched. One was with a wealthy family. One was a slave that was light skinned or something like that. It was sort of the prince and the pauper switched. And I was like, look, I know people going through that right now, or some version of that. Right. And I understood Tom Wolfe's sensibility based on what we went through. Right.
Absolutely. Well, it's so funny when I think of Tom Wolfe, I always think of Man in Full, and I think about the first chapter because it really explains how crime happens in this one chapter, like how for like somebody in the working class, if it might only take 3 small chaotic disasters before you make a decision and it really explained to me in a way that no lecturer could really do. It really showed me like empathy and starting to understand. And that's what good fiction does. And I agree. I mean, but the thing is, you're talking Death of the Salon. I hated that. And I still am not sure why it would be in the Pantheon. Like, I'm all right with that. Like, but here's
I'm laughing because I'm like, lady, I just remember Kathy Perfetta, she was on it, right? Like they love Kathy Perfetta. And I say, look, if I can somehow figure out what Kathy's doing without really having to do it, that would be great, because I just need to get through this class.
That's just being a good student, which is what you should do. But, for me, and I have to say, like, I'm actually like just starting, I'm working on this really interesting project with several women, and it's called the Polymath Project. And what we're doing is it's all creators, artists included. And I gave 3 prompts. It was like a Paul Strand photograph. It was an essay. And I just said, create something, no rules in response. And then since then, now we're responding to whatever anybody created.
I see.
Then. And so what's been fascinating is that now what I'm working on in response, now we're like sort of three meetings removed from the initial prompt. Is that I'm really working on an essay about a concept of like a nobody boy or a fake girl in the sense of these sort of gender ideas, because growing up, I really identified with Laura Ingalls or identified with Anne of Green Gables, but the mouthy tomboy, right? But then I was always so disappointed because then in all the stories, and this was true for all the literature, right? The girl gets married and then they're saved, like they were saved. And so watching Raiders of the Lost Ark, I was like, no, I'm Indiana Jones. Like I am Indiana Jones. I am not the other person. So I so balked at so much of the literature that we read in high school.
Right.
Because I was like, I am not here. And so I completely
you understand what I'm saying.
Race lens, like you're not there. And while I agree that there is something and there is a value when we talk about going back to sort of the weaving of the blanket, or the weaving is that to tie us all together, what I loved when I first met, so Eric is my partner and he's exactly my age, but he grew up in Northern California. And when we met, you know what, we were having dinner and the thing is he read Catcher in the Rye. And he read, we were talking about which Shakespeare play we were required to read.
I get it.
And then it gave us a commonality. So where I love the idea that everybody's like, oh, let's go local and let's do this. I was like, that's going to be so hard because then you can't, it's so hard to find common ground.
Now, you do need to have that. You do need to have it.
Why aren't we reading Toni Morrison? I mean, and it might be that now people are really reading Toni Morrison, but what I find so annoying is then it needs to be in a literature in women or African American literature, and I'm like, no, that shouldn't be how it is, right? And so release your guilt, David, with Death of a Salesperson.
I feel no guilt. I tell you that. I feel no guilt, but I do look. But I do understand now, many years later, why it was important for me to know that particular body of work. And I think that it does do what you've just talked about, what we need to have happen now in this moment. Now, am I a big fan of Toni Morrison? No, not necessarily. I probably would be like, the same way. But what I do find is that one of the things, and maybe I'll throw this out to you, and then we're going to go to art in Italy, because I want to cover this before we hit the half hour. In today's world, given everything that's going on, what would be required reading for someone in high school, given everything? And this is something we can come back to, but based on what you think is, now part of that is like some of the classics that we always talk about, but there's got to be new people coming into the fray. And so if you have a semester, what are you going to tell the students to read? And why would you tell those students to read those particular books? I think that's the question. I'm not asking you to answer it now, but I think it's really, really interesting, because I still think back about how I didn't like sitting in that class when I needed to, be going to university, and I felt like this woman was holding us up. She even threatened to give us bad grades because we weren't turning in things on time. Kathy, of course, was, but of course, I was trying to get the heck out like you were. I'm trying to leave, you see.
That's so
but
funny.
I think it's an interesting question.
I think so too, but I think there is something to, it's hard, right? Also, just when thinking about language and how it's changed, even when you said, Toni Morrison, because Toni Morrison is very dense. It's very dense language. And we're living in a world, especially our generation and younger,
yes,
where we were brought up on active voice. We were brought up in shorter snippets. And so the reason why it's easier for most of us to still grasp, even if we don't like Ernest Hemingway or Catcher in the Rye, J.D. Salinger, is also because the writing feels a little more modern. When you're slugging through something written in the 50s or before, it's written in passive voice, it's really drawn out, it's very dense, and that's a struggle. Now, I could certainly put together a reading list. I would love to put together a reading list. I mean, that's
your reading list. Yes, we'll do that for the next time.
And I do it for my law students usually in the summer. I'll send, I'm also director of the writing center there. So I'll just, use my I really do use my place at the law school to make sure that people are remembering to be good citizens and good humans. It's very important to me because, we get so wrapped up in being a lawyer that we kind of forget there's a whole person. So I'll say what you should do over the summer. You should be reading. Here's some good books. But at Jacaranda School for Orphans, I work with kids there and trying to find, because at Jacaranda, it's donated books. Right, so you're going through the donated books library, and it's how many copies of Jane Eyre can a library actually have? And the idea is and these kids growing up in Limbe, Malawi with, a mat, little electricity, it's a school for orphans, 70% of them have HIV or AIDS, and you're giving them Jane Eyre. And even when teaching, I was in the 3rd grade, I teach a variety of different grades, and then I actually put together a writing literary journal when I'm there. I work with the high school kids, and we put together a literary journal. And what's exciting though is I went into the 3rd grade and I was I'm going to read to them, just storytelling. But I took the Little Engine That Could. Well, it was an older version, so it was a very blonde version of Little Engine That Could. I heard now it's less
dangerous.
It's less blonde. But here's the thing. One of the kids didn't know what a train was.
Oh, wow. Okay. So
But I mean, so you are challenged every day. And so all these all these great, kind-hearted people sending books.
Right.
But a lot of the books aren't going to land, and so that idea is when building a high school curriculum, to me, it would be the same thing. An honest, one book should push you. Yeah, we are going to do something dense. And here's what the value is. Right. But then other things that are going to land, because you're building self-esteem in school too. So you want to see yourself reflected back.
Yeah. Interesting. It is, look, it's funny, probably when I was in high school, this is probably what I was thinking about, and not actually doing the work. I was thinking about how is this going to impact, society, or how is this going to,
Right.
that was the thing that was probably going through my mind the whole time that I was there.
Yeah.
Right. Which doesn't necessarily, do you the best when you're trying to excel academically. I think that the reason why I was able to get into school was the fact that I was as you say, what do you call it, a polymath? I was that, but I didn't even know it.
Right.
I did not know it. So here I'm writing all this crazy stuff about why I should be there, and literally thinking like, well, didn't put any emphasis on my, my extracurricular activities, because now in hindsight, I can see, I was like, Dave, you were doing a lot. Like you did, I didn't realize how much of an impact that was. I was doing a lot.
You were such a creative leader. Like in high school, like I remember you as being, I was very intimidated of Kathy Profeta because she just
we're talking about her, like, and I tag her on this video, like, Kathy, we talked about you. We talked about you. So anyway, go on. So you were,
but I mean, I remember you as a creative leader.
Yeah.
Like that's what I remember about you. And it is a shame. That is sort of a shame that you didn't even know that your own value. But I was experiencing similar, because the pressure to excel academically was, it was high. And so the idea is like you measured yourself, we measured ourselves that way, and not with, oh, like there's all this other stuff. Like it didn't even occur to me, I had all these stories, I had all this poetry, like all this stuff that I was sort of doing away from school. Never even occurred to me to bring that up in a college interview. Never occurred to me to even talk about that because I was so pre-med at the time. For me, I was just like, well, here's my math SAT score. Here's this, here are my grades. And by the way, I was in band, and, so here's like a tape of me playing the flute, it was very vanilla in the end. And I didn't even realize my own value. That's youth to some degree.
Yeah, I think it's different now because, let's say, if you were to have a child, imagine what you'd be teaching this child. I mean, it'd be doing all kinds of things, and without any not barriers, what is it? Without any feeling bad for being able to explore this. Well, let me ask you real quickly. Your views on art. We said we're going to talk about this, and I added at the end that I wanted to get your take on Italy and how important that is. And if we don't have enough time, then we'll save that for the book list, and we'll go into that later.
All right.
Right.
Art is, I have to say, like my art, my parents were big, we went to museums. I mean, living outside New York City, it was what a beautiful experience, right? Like, so for me, it was the weekends, parents would take me, I would be at a museum at least twice a month with the parents growing up. So for me, I felt very blessed. I was bored out of my mind when I was 8, but it made an impact. And I went to Italy, going to bring it in. I went to Italy, my parents, it was the big trip at 16 or 15, and they took me, and we did Florence, Rome, and Venice. And it changed, seeing that aesthetic and seeing the masters, and like, again, like walking down the street and just seeing the Colosseum, like living in history and living in art, it opened up a little window for me. And then I have to say, like, I really call my 20s like the great unlearning for me, because I was a color inside the lines kind of kid. And I wanted to start saying, well, what if I just didn't do that? Like, what if there were no rules? What if I actually put my ego on a shelf and just started to like have fun, like using my hands and creating things? And I took art classes. And what's amazing is that my first painting class with this great artist named Todd Brown, he was up in Northern California, but he would laugh. He's like, how come everything you do turns out to be Pepto-Bismol? Like, why is everything look like an intestinal tract with Pepto-Bismol? Like, why? And I'm like, I don't know, but I'm not judging myself. Like, And then, you know, when you start to create, like when you really start to like plug yourself into creating, and I love like how artists really, all artists have to trust a process where, you know, as a lawyer, you think about results. You're very result oriented, and we're very judge oriented. And to really embrace the art process of not knowing what the result's going to be, not having to just trust that something will connect. And so, I mean, I have an art practice that is completely amateur, is completely my hobby, because it gives me life. And in seeing art still, and I'm a big fan of contemporary art. So it's interesting, like when I travel, I try not just it's in Europe, but anywhere I go, I also just try to find the galleries, and not like the fine art galleries on the pier where, you know, tourists go. I'm talking about the contemporary art galleries where you're seeing, again, local artists who are in the struggle, and like, what are they creating? Because that then gives you a reflection, like, onto like what's going on in society. So like you try to do both, you know, so like some of the art scene in South Africa is really, really interesting right now, because race is still very much at the forefront. So everybody goes to Cape Town and wants to talk about, you know, hiking and parasailing, but I'm telling you, it's very interesting to go and like educate yourself about race there as well. And if you go into the regional art galleries or the small local art galleries, you're going to really learn a lot about what that country, but what that community, you know, even just in the small Cape Town area, is really going through. And it just explodes your mind, and it gets you really excited. And so that's sort of what art means to me. And writing and creating art's lonely, right? So through the guides, like I'm a creative writing coach. I'm a creative coach in my other spare time. But the thing is, I put on an annual art and literary salon where I'm really, instead of it being a place where everybody judges, it's really a place where people feel safe. I only invite creators. And so like it might be 50 people, but there are 50 people who are creating on some level. And like last year, the theme was fashion and identity. And 2 actors wrote a scene and acted it out. Somebody did a talk on cultural appropriation. Somebody else did a talk on holistic styling. I took out all my art, and I had 3 artists put in art all on the walls, and so we could walk through. And then I did and then people read short stories or essays, and you know, there was wine, cheese, whatever. But the idea is that it excites people, right? It starts to build a community, and that's what art
supposed to do. Part of it, yeah.
It's so exciting.
Well, look, you know, I'm going to leave it there. Next time we talk about the writing list. We talk about Italy more, because you were traveling. When I connected with you, now we've been on social media and I've seen you and watched you, but I think when I was in Catania, you were in Palermo, and I was like, wow. Or I think I had just come back, and I was like, I mean, when I tell you I was knocked out, I was knocked out. And I will tell you this: when I go to Italy, the thing that I think is amazing, it's the people, it's in the way they express everything, right? And they know I'm not from there, right? But they know that I have an interest in some way because I'm speaking Italian with them, or you know, the way I'm coming into the store, it's almost like to engage, right? It's right, and they understand that top to bottom, and that's what I love. So next time we're going to talk about that.
All right.
And some other things as well. But you know, I'm going to give you the last word. Anything else that you would like to say before we close? We could go for a little bit longer, you guys, but we need to close it.
Yeah, no, I get it. The only thing I want to sort of say is, you know, give a listen to the podcast. It's Women Bridging the Gap, and you can find us at womenbridgingthegap.com. So subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. But that's it. I mean, this was great, and I just love seeing your face, and it just feels like it's great to connect, and that's it.
Yeah, well, look, well, thank you so much. You guys, I'm gonna upload as fast as I can. I got to come up with something real quick, right? And it's fantastic. You know what I mean? And I think, as you know, this is what I would say. The kind of exchange that we had was very indicative of the way high school, our community was when we were growing up, right? So when we come to a place where it's not happening anymore, I'm like, hey, come on, you guys, let's just because you're in your 50s doesn't mean that you all of a sudden give that up, right? So it's another, motivation for me to reach out to you and, and connect. And, I'm very thankful that you said yes. And here we are. So thank you again. And I'll speak to you soon.
All right. That sounds great.
All right. Have a good evening, weekend. Hopefully not so humid and
just hopefully no fires.
All right. Take care. We'll speak soon. Bye-bye.